The rattlesnake's tail began its deadly warning just as Teresa Thompson reached for the wooden door handle of the abandoned mining shack, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to escape the three men who had been trailing her through the California mountains since dawn. The year was 1873, and Downeyville had become a desperate place for a woman alone after her father's death in the mines 3 weeks prior, leaving her with nothing but debts and dangerous men who claimed he owed them money she did not have. The serpent lay coiled in the shadow between her trembling body and the only shelter for miles, its diamond-patterned scales catching the late afternoon sun as it prepared to strike. And Teresa felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she stumbled backward on the rocky ground, her worn boots sliding on loose stones. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush behind her made her whip around, expecting to see the trio of debt collectors who had chased her from town. But instead, she found herself staring at the broadest chest she had ever seen, covered in buckskin and flannel that strained against muscles built from years of survival in these unforgiving mountains. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun and arms thick as tree branches, his long dark hair tied back with a leather cord that had come loose enough to let strands fall around a face carved from granite and patience. His eyes, a startling shade of green like new pine needles, assessed her situation in a single glance before moving to the rattlesnake still coiled and ready to strike. "Do not move," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow calmed the panic threatening to overwhelm her completely. Not even to breathe heavy. Teresa froze, watching as the massive man moved with surprising grace around her, positioning himself between her body and the serpent. He carried a long walking stick made from oak, weathered and strong, and he used it now to gently prod the ground near the snake, drawing its attention away from the terrified woman behind him. The rattlesnake struck at the stick with lightning speed, its fangs sinking into the wood instead of flesh. And in that moment, the mountain man used his free hand to grab the creature just behind its head with practiced precision. "Got you," he murmured to the snake, his voice almost gentle as he carried it away from the door and released it into the rocks a safe distance away, waiting until it slithered into a crevice before turning back to Teresa. "You can breathe now, miss." Teresa released the breath she had been holding, her knees suddenly weak as the terror of the past hours caught up with her all at once. She swayed on her feet, and before she could fall, the mountain man was there, his large hands steadying her with surprising gentleness despite their obvious strength. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the shadow of stubble along his strong jaw, the way his brow furrowed with concern as he studied her face. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from running and fear. "I thought I was going to die." "You are far from town," he observed, still holding her elbow to keep her steady. "And you look like you have been running from something more than just a snake." Before Teresa could answer, the sound of men shouting echoed through the trees below them, and she tensed immediately, her eyes going wide with fresh terror. The mountain man felt the change in her posture and his expression hardened, his jaw setting in a way that made him look even more formidable than before. "Those men after you?" he asked quietly. Teresa nodded, finding her voice again despite her fear. "They say my father owed them money before he died in the mines. I do not have what they claim, but they will not listen. They followed me from town this morning, and I have been running ever since." The mountain man's eyes narrowed as he looked down the mountain toward the voices, calculating distances and options with the quick mind of someone who had survived countless dangers in these wilds. He made a decision quickly, reaching for the door of the mining shack and pulling it open with ease, checking inside for any other threats before gesturing for Teresa to enter. "In here," he commanded. "Stay quiet and stay back from the door." Teresa hurried inside the small structure, which smelled of old wood and earth, but seemed blessedly empty of snakes or other creatures. The mountain man followed her in, pulling the door closed behind him but not latching it, positioning himself so he could see through a gap in the weathered boards. They stood in the dimness together, and Teresa became acutely aware of how small the space was, how close his large frame stood to hers, radiating warmth and a sense of safety she had not felt since her father died. "What is your name?" she whispered, needing to know who this man was who had appeared like some kind of guardian spirit when she needed help most desperately. "Ethan Taylor," he replied without taking his eyes from the gap in the door. "I trap and hunt in these mountains, have a cabin about 5 miles north of here." "I am Teresa Thompson," she offered, watching his profile in the scattered light that came through the cracks in the walls. "My father was Samuel Thompson. He worked the mines in Downeyville until a collapse took him and 4 other men last month." Ethan glanced at her then, and she saw something soften in his hard features, a brief glimpse of sympathy and understanding. "I heard about that collapse. I am sorry for your loss. Your father had a good reputation in town as an honest man." The voices outside grew louder, and Teresa pressed herself against the back wall of the shack, her heart racing again as she heard the men spreading out to search the area. There were 3 distinct voices, rough and crude, arguing about which direction she might have gone. Ethan remained perfectly still by the door, one hand resting on the large knife at his belt, his breathing slow and controlled. "She could not have gotten far," one man was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Stupid girl probably twisted an ankle running through these rocks. When we find her, maybe we will take payment another way," a second man suggested with a cruel laugh that made Teresa's stomach turn. "Pretty little thing like that ought to be worth something." Ethan's hand tightened on his knife handle, his jaw clenching so hard Teresa could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. He looked back at her with an expression that promised protection, that wordlessly told her he would not let those men touch her. And Teresa felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of strength and honor that she had not known still existed in the world after the past weeks of grief and fear. The men searched for another 10 minutes that felt like hours, passing close enough to the shack that Teresa could hear their boots scuffing on stone. But eventually they moved on, their voices fading as they headed further up the mountain. Ethan waited long after the sounds disappeared before finally relaxing his stance, turning to face Teresa in the dimness. "They will come back this way when they do not find you above," he said. "We need to move before they do. Can you walk?" Teresa nodded, though in truth her legs felt like water and her feet ached terribly in her worn boots. Ethan must have seen the exhaustion in her face because he frowned slightly, studying her with those keen green eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted to reveal. "When did you last eat?" he asked. The question caught her off guard, and Teresa realized she could not remember her last real meal. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before." Ethan shook his head, moving to the door and checking outside carefully before opening it. "Come with me to my cabin. You need food and rest, and we need to figure out what to do about those men. I will not let them hurt you." The simple declaration, spoken with such absolute certainty, made Teresa's throat tighten with emotion. She had been alone for so long, fighting so hard just to survive each day, that the offer of help felt almost unreal. She followed Ethan out of the shack, blinking in the bright sunlight, and watched as he surveyed the area with the practiced eye of someone who knew every rock and tree in these mountains. "Stay close to me," he instructed, setting off at a pace that was quick but manageable, glancing back frequently to make sure she could keep up. "Step where I step if you can. It will make our trail harder to follow." They walked for over an hour, climbing higher into the mountains along paths that Teresa would never have found on her own, routes that seemed to appear only when Ethan needed them and disappeared again behind them. He moved with the confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness, his large frame navigating the rough terrain with surprising ease, occasionally reaching back to help Teresa over particularly difficult sections. His hand would engulf hers completely, warm and calloused and strong, pulling her up steep inclines or steadying her across loose scree. And each time he touched her, Teresa felt that same strange flutter in her chest, a feeling she had no business entertaining given her current circumstances. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Ethan finally led her into a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. His cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, built from solid logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a small covered porch across the front. It was humble but well-maintained, with stacks of firewood neatly arranged under the eaves and animal pelts stretched on frames for drying. A small stream ran nearby, its water crystal clear as it tumbled over smooth stones, and Teresa could see a garden plot behind the cabin where vegetables grew in neat rows. "It is not much," Ethan said, seeming almost embarrassed as he led her up the 2 steps to the porch. "But it is warm and dry, and I have plenty of food." "It is wonderful," Teresa said honestly, meaning every word. After the past weeks of uncertainty and fear, the cabin represented safety and peace, a refuge from the chaos her life had become. Ethan opened the door and gestured for her to enter first, following her into a single large room that served as living space, kitchen, and bedroom all in one. The interior was as neat as the exterior, with a large stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a sturdy table and chairs in the center, shelves lined with supplies and tools, and a wide bed frame in the far corner covered with furs and blankets. Everything spoke of a man who valued order and self-sufficiency, who had built a life in these mountains through skill and hard work. "Sit," Ethan instructed, pulling out one of the chairs at the table. "I will make food." Teresa sank into the chair gratefully, watching as Ethan moved around the cabin with economical efficiency, building up the fire in the hearth and hanging a pot of water to heat, pulling out supplies from various storage areas, and preparing a meal with practiced hands. He moved well for such a large man, with none of the clumsiness she might have expected from someone his size, and she found herself fascinated by the way his muscles flexed beneath his shirt as he worked, the way his long hair fell forward over his shoulders when he leaned over the fire. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, needing to fill the comfortable silence with something. "5 years," Ethan replied, slicing salt pork into a pan. "I came west after the war, tried living in towns for a while, but it never felt right. Too many people, too much noise. The mountains suit me better." Teresa heard what he did not say, the hint of pain in his voice when he mentioned the war. She knew many men had come west trying to escape memories of those terrible years, looking for peace in the wilderness when they could not find it among civilization. She wondered what Ethan had seen, what battles he had fought, but she did not ask. Some wounds were too deep to probe, especially between people who had only just met. "You ever get lonely?" she asked instead. Ethan paused in his work, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I prefer loneliness to the company of people who only want something from me. Up here, everything is honest. An animal is what it is, a storm does what it does. No lying, no pretending." Teresa understood that sentiment more than he could know. Since her father died, it seemed everyone in Downieville had wanted something from her, whether it was money she did not have or favors she would not give. The honest simplicity of the mountains suddenly seemed very appealing, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to stay in a place like this, far from the demands and dangers of town life. Ethan finished preparing the meal and brought 2 plates to the table, loaded with fried salt pork, beans, and thick slices of bread he must have baked himself. The smell alone made Teresa's mouth water, and when she took her first bite, she nearly groaned with relief, the simple food tasting better than anything she could remember eating. Ethan watched her with satisfaction, eating his own meal in companionable silence, occasionally glancing toward the door and windows out of habit, always alert even in his own home. "Thank you," Teresa said when she finally pushed her empty plate away, feeling more human than she had in days. "For everything. The snake, those men, this food. I do not know what I would have done if you had not appeared when you did." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Any decent person would have done the same. "No," Teresa said firmly, meeting his eyes across the table. "They would not. I have learned in recent weeks that decent people are much rarer than I once believed. You saved my life today, Ethan Taylor, and I will not forget it." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that went deeper than simple gratitude, and Ethan looked away first, clearing his throat as he stood to collect their plates. Teresa felt the loss of his gaze like a physical thing, and she realized with some surprise that she wanted him to look at her again, wanted to see that flash of warmth in his green eyes. "You can sleep in the bed," Ethan said, carrying the plates to a wash basin. "I will take the floor by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Teresa protested. "You have already done too much." "You will take the bed," Ethan repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "You are exhausted and you need proper rest. I have slept on worse than a cabin floor, believe me." Teresa wanted to argue further, but the thought of that wide bed piled with soft furs was almost unbearably tempting. Her body ached from running and fear, and she could feel exhaustion pulling at her like a heavy weight. She nodded her acceptance, too tired to maintain pride in the face of such obvious need. As the evening deepened into night, Ethan showed her where she could wash up using water heated over the fire and a cloth he provided, turning his back to give her privacy in the small space. Teresa cleaned away the dust and sweat of the day as best she could, wishing she had clean clothes to change into but grateful just to feel less filthy. When she finished, she found Ethan had laid out one of his shirts for her to sleep in, the garment so large it would serve as a nightdress, and she felt her cheeks warm at the intimacy of wearing his clothing. She changed behind a blanket Ethan hung for her, pulling on the soft flannel shirt that smelled of pine smoke and something distinctly masculine, something that was purely him. It hung to her knees, and the sleeves covered her hands completely, and when she emerged from behind the blanket, she found Ethan staring at her with an expression she could not quite read, something heated and tender all at once before he looked away quickly. "The bed is ready," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. Teresa climbed into the bed, sinking into furs that were softer than anything she had felt in years, and pulled the heavy blankets up to her chin. From this vantage point, she could see Ethan spreading blankets on the floor near the fire, arranging them into a makeshift bed with the ease of long practice. Even in the firelight, she could see the play of muscles across his back and shoulders, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to be held by those strong arms, to be protected not just from snakes and dangerous men, but from all the sorrows and fears that haunted her. "Ethan." She called softly into the darkness. Yes. He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. What will we do about those men? They will not give up. They are determined to collect what they think I owe them. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, weighing options. Tomorrow I will go into town and speak with the sheriff. Ben Russell is a fair man, and he will not allow debt collectors to chase a woman through the mountains like an animal. We will settle this properly, through the law. And if the law does not help? Teresa asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks. Then I will handle it another way, Ethan said simply, and there was something in his tone that sent a shiver down Teresa's spine. A reminder that this gentle man who had saved her from a snake and fed her dinner was also someone who had survived a war and 5 years alone in the wilderness. Someone who would be very dangerous if pushed. Teresa felt oddly comforted by that dangerous edge, by the knowledge that he would protect her if it came to that. She settled deeper into the bed, watching the firelight play across the cabin ceiling, listening to Ethan's breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep on the floor. She should have been afraid, alone in a cabin with a strange man miles from anywhere. But instead she felt safer than she had in months, wrapped in his shirt and his blankets, guarded by his presence. Sleep took her gently, pulling her down into dreams that were blessedly free of fear for the first time in weeks. Teresa woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows in golden streams full of dancing dust motes. For a moment she could not remember where she was, the events of the previous day seeming almost like a dream. But then she heard movement and saw Ethan at the stove, his back to her, as he prepared breakfast. He had tied his long hair back again, and he wore a clean shirt that strained across his broad shoulders, and Teresa felt her heart do a strange little flip in her chest as she watched him work. "Good morning," she said, sitting up in the bed. Ethan turned, and a smile crossed his face when he saw her awake, a smile that transformed his serious features into something almost boyish. "Good morning. I hope I did not wake you. I am not used to having to be quiet in the mornings." "You did not wake me," Teresa assured him, pushing back the blankets and standing. She became acutely aware that she wore only his shirt, her legs bare beneath it, and she saw Ethan's eyes flick down and then quickly away, a flush rising in his tanned cheeks. "I will step outside while you dress," he said, moving toward the door with his coffee cup. "Breakfast will be ready when you are." After he left, Teresa changed back into her own clothes, now dry from hanging near the fire overnight, though they were still dusty and worn. She felt almost sad to take off Ethan's shirt, to lose that sense of being wrapped in his scent and warmth, but she folded it carefully and placed it on the bed before joining him outside. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect mountain day that made everything seem possible. Ethan stood on the porch looking out over the valley below, and when Teresa joined him, he handed her a cup of coffee without a word. They stood together in comfortable silence, sipping the strong brew and watching the world wake up around them. "I will ride into town this morning," Ethan said finally. "I want you to stay here where it is safe. Can you shoot?" Teresa nodded. "My father taught me when I was young. I am not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at if it is close enough." Ethan seemed satisfied with that answer. He went back inside and returned with a rifle, showing her how to load and fire it, making her practice the motions until he was confident she could manage if needed. His hands covered hers as he guided her through the steps, his touch sending warmth through her entire body, and she found it difficult to concentrate on his instructions when she was so aware of his nearness. "If anyone comes who is not me, you bar the door and you shoot if they try to force their way in," he instructed seriously. "Do not hesitate, do not warn them. These mountains are not kind to hesitation." "I understand," Teresa said, though the thought of having to shoot someone made her feel slightly sick. Still, she remembered the way those men had talked about her yesterday, the cruel suggestions in their voices, and she knew she would pull the trigger if it meant protecting herself. Ethan saddled his horse, a large bay gelding that seemed perfectly suited to his size, and swung up into the saddle with easy grace. He looked down at Teresa with concern clear on his face, obviously reluctant to leave her, even though he knew it was necessary. "I will be back before dark," he promised. "Stay inside, stay alert. You will be safe here." Teresa watched him ride away down the mountain, following a trail she could barely see, and when he disappeared from view, she felt suddenly very alone. She went back inside the cabin and barred the door as he had instructed, then set about trying to make herself useful. She washed their breakfast dishes, tidied the already neat space, and even ventured to make bread dough from the supplies she found, wanting to contribute something to repay his kindness. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching long as she waited for Ethan's return. She tried not to worry, tried not to imagine all the things that could go wrong in town, but her mind insisted on conjuring various disasters. What if those men were in Downeyville? What if they recognized Ethan as someone who might be helping her? What if there was violence? By the time the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Teresa was pacing the cabin floor, jumping at every sound outside, the rifle never far from her hands. She had just decided that if Ethan was not back within the hour, she would go looking for him, impossible as that would be, when she heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Teresa grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the window, peering out carefully. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Ethan's large frame on the bay horse, but it was quickly followed by concern when she saw he was not alone. A second man rode beside him, older and wearing a sheriff's star on his vest, and behind them came a wagon driven by a woman Teresa did not recognize. She unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch as they arrived, watching as Ethan dismounted and came toward her with an expression she could not quite read. "Teresa, this is Sheriff Ben Russell," Ethan said, gesturing to the older man who had also dismounted. "And this is Martha Wells, the preacher's wife. I asked them to come because we need to settle this situation properly." The sheriff was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He tipped his hat to Teresa respectfully. "Miss Thompson, I am sorry for the trouble you have been having. Ethan here filled me in on what happened yesterday, and I want you to know those men had no legal right to chase you or threaten you in any way." "They said my father owed them money," Teresa explained, feeling defensive despite the sheriff's friendly tone. "Your father owed nobody nothing," Sheriff Russell said firmly. "I checked with the bank and with every merchant in town. Samuel Thompson paid his debts and died owing nothing but the respect every man deserved. Those three who chased you are known troublemakers who prey on people in vulnerable positions. They have warrants out for fraud in Sacramento, and I have sent word to the marshal there. They will be dealt with." The relief that washed over Teresa was so intense she felt her knees weaken, and Ethan was immediately there, his hand on her elbow to steady her. She looked up at him with gratitude shining in her eyes, unable to find words for what she felt. "There is more," Ethan said gently. "Your father's share in the mine where he died is worth something. Not a fortune, but enough to give you a fresh start if you want it. The company has been holding the money waiting for you to claim it, but you have to come to town to sign papers." Martha Wells, a plump woman with a kind face, spoke up from the wagon. "We have also taken the liberty of packing up your belongings from your father's house, dear. The landlord was going to sell everything to cover rent, but the sheriff here convinced him to wait." Everything your father owned is in this wagon, waiting for you to decide what you want to do with it." Teresa felt overwhelmed by their kindness, by the way these strangers had rallied to help her when she had been so alone. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked them back, trying to maintain her composure. "I do not know what to say," she managed. "Thank you, all of you." "No thanks needed," Sheriff Russell said gruffly. "Just doing what is right. Now about your living situation. You cannot go back to that house in town, not until we are sure those men are caught. Do you have family elsewhere? Somewhere safe you can go?" Teresa shook her head. "My mother died when I was young. My father was all I had." An awkward silence fell, everyone recognizing the difficult position she was in. A young woman alone, with no family and limited means, faced very few good options in a place like Downeyville. Teresa felt her brief hope fading, reality crashing back in on her like a cold wave. "She can stay here," Ethan said suddenly, his voice firm, "until it is safe for her to return to town or make other arrangements. I have room and she would be protected." Sheriff Russell and Martha Wells exchanged a long look, clearly understanding the implications of such an arrangement. A young, unmarried woman living alone with a man in the mountains would cause talk, would damage her reputation beyond repair, no matter how innocent the situation actually was. "Ethan," Martha said gently, "you know that would not be proper. People would talk, and Teresa's reputation would be ruined. She would never be able to marry well or live peacefully in town after that." "Then I will marry her," Ethan said, the words coming out before he seemed to fully think them through. He looked at Teresa with surprise in his own eyes, as if he had not planned to say that, but now that he had, he found he meant it. "If she will have me, I will marry her. Today, if possible. Then no one can say anything improper is happening." Teresa stared at him in shock, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Marry him. She had known this man for barely 24 hours, and yet the idea did not seem nearly as crazy as it should have. She thought about his gentleness despite his strength, his kindness, the way he had protected her without asking for anything in return. She thought about waking up to the smell of coffee he made, about the safety she felt in his presence, about the way her heart fluttered when he looked at her. "Ethan, you do not have to do this," she said softly, giving him a way out even though the thought of him taking it made her chest ache. "You do not owe me anything more than you have already given." "I know I do not have to," Ethan replied, stepping closer to her, his green eyes intense as they held hers. "But I want to. Teresa, I know this is fast, and I know you do not really know me yet, but I can promise you that I will work hard to take care of you, to give you a good life up here. You will never have to be afraid again, never have to run from men who want to hurt you. I will protect you with everything I have." "But why?" Teresa asked, needing to understand. "Why would you tie yourself to a stranger? You have a good life here alone." Ethan was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with words. "Because when I saw you yesterday, terrified with that snake between you and safety, something in me just knew. I cannot explain it better than that. And then having you here last night, cooking for someone besides myself, hearing another voice in this cabin, it felt right in a way nothing has felt right since I came to these mountains. Maybe I am crazy, but I do not think so. I think maybe sometimes you just know when something is meant to be." Teresa felt tears spill over now, running down her cheeks as she looked up at this incredible man who was offering her not just safety but a home, a partnership, a future. She thought about going back to town, to the small rooms and the gossip and the struggle to survive on her own. Then she thought about staying here, about building a life with Ethan in these beautiful mountains, about learning to know him slowly over years instead of rushing things in weeks. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Taylor. A smile broke across Ethan's face like sunrise over the peaks, and he reached out to cup her cheek with one large hand, his thumb wiping away her tears with surprising tenderness. You will not regret this, he promised. I swear to you. Well then, Sheriff Russell said, clearing his throat and looking pleased despite the unusual circumstances. I suppose we need to get the preacher up here. Martha, you think Reverend Wells would be willing to make the trip? Martha laughed, her eyes twinkling. For a wedding this romantic. He will be delighted. Though we should probably do it properly, give you two a few days to be sure. This is a big decision. No, Teresa said quickly, surprising herself with her certainty. Let us do it today, as Ethan suggested, I am sure. She was sure, she realized. More sure than she had been about anything in a long time. Maybe it was impulsive, maybe it was crazy, but it felt absolutely right in a way that went beyond logic or reason. This man had saved her life, had offered her everything he had without expecting anything in return, and her heart had somehow known in just one day that he was someone she could love, someone she wanted to love. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Russell rode back to town to fetch Reverend Wells, while Martha helped Teresa sort through the belongings in the wagon, finding a dress that was suitable for a wedding, simple but clean and pretty. Martha also offered her own mother's ring as something borrowed, and between the two women they managed to make Teresa look like a proper bride despite the rushed circumstances. Ethan, for his part, seemed almost dazed by the speed at which his life was changing. He cleaned the cabin until it shone, changed into his best shirt, and even trimmed his beard and retied his hair neatly. Teresa caught him looking at her several times with an expression of wonder, as if he could not quite believe this was really happening. By late afternoon, Reverend Wells arrived with his wife and the sheriff, along with two other townspeople who had come along to serve as additional witnesses. The Reverend was a jovial man in his 60s, who seemed genuinely delighted by the unusual situation, declaring it the most romantic thing he had witnessed in all his years in California. They held the ceremony outside in front of the cabin, with the mountains rising majestically in the background and the setting sun painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Teresa stood facing Ethan, her hands clasped in his much larger ones, and listened as Reverend Wells spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. When it came time for vows, Ethan spoke as clearly and firmly, promising to love and cherish her, to protect and provide for her all the days of his life. His eyes never left hers, and Teresa could see the sincerity in them, the absolute commitment he was making. Then it was her turn, and Teresa spoke her vows with a full heart, promising to be a faithful and loving wife, to build a life with him in these mountains, to stand by his side through whatever challenges they might face. Her voice shook slightly with emotion, but she meant every word with her entire being. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Wells declared with satisfaction. Ethan, you may kiss your bride. Ethan leaned down slowly, giving Teresa time to pull away if she wanted to, but she rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a gentle kiss that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through Teresa's entire body. It was her first kiss, and it felt like a promise, like the beginning of something beautiful. The small group of witnesses cheered and offered congratulations, and Martha produced a cake she had somehow managed to bake and bring up the mountain, insisting they needed proper wedding cake, even if everything else was improvised. They all ate cake and drank coffee as the sun set, talking and laughing, and Teresa felt surrounded by unexpected community, by kindness she had not known still existed in the world, As darkness fell, the visitors prepared to leave, wanting to make it back to town before it got too late. Martha hugged Teresa tightly, whispering in her ear, "He is a good man, dear. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at you. You will be happy here." Sheriff Russell shook Ethan's hand firmly. "You take care of her, Taylor, and if those men cause any more trouble, you send word immediately. Though I doubt they will be foolish enough to come after a married woman with a husband like you." Then they were gone, and Teresa and Ethan were alone together, married, the reality of what they had done settling over them both. They stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the wagon and horses disappear down the mountain, neither quite sure what to say or do next. "Are you hungry?" Ethan asked finally, falling back on the practical. "There is leftover cake, and I could make something more substantial." "I am fine," Teresa said, though in truth she felt too nervous to eat. She was married now, married to this man she barely knew, and the night stretched ahead of them full of expectations she was not sure she understood. Ethan must have sensed her nervousness because he turned to face her, his expression gentle. "Teresa, I want you to know that I do not expect anything from you tonight, or any night until you are ready. I meant what I said about taking care of you, about giving you time to know me. We may be married by law and by God, but I will not rush you into anything you are not comfortable with." The relief Teresa felt was profound, and she reached out to touch his arm gratefully. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that more than you know. This is all so new, so fast." "I know," Ethan agreed. "It is fast for me too. I woke up yesterday morning expecting a normal day of checking traps and cutting wood, and now I have a wife. A beautiful wife," he added, his cheeks flushing slightly as he said it. Teresa felt her own face warm at the compliment. "You think I am beautiful? I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Ethan said honestly. "I thought so yesterday when I saw you by that shack, even terrified and exhausted as you were. You have strength in your eyes and courage. It shows in your face." No one had ever spoken to Teresa that way before, with such sincere admiration, and she felt something bloom in her chest, something warm and hopeful. She stepped closer to Ethan, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "I think you are beautiful too," she said. "Strong and kind and more handsome than you probably realize." Ethan smiled at that, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger. "Beautiful is not usually a word applied to men like me." "Then people are not looking properly," Teresa replied. "May I kiss you again?" The question seemed to surprise and please Ethan in equal measure. "You never have to ask permission to kiss your husband," he said softly. "But yes, I would like that very much." This kiss was different from the one during the ceremony. This one was just for them, with no audience and no expectations, and they took their time with it, learning the shape and taste of each other, letting the attraction that had been building between them since yesterday express itself in gentle touches. Ethan kept his hands respectfully on Teresa's waist, and she rested her palms on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her fingers. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing harder, and Teresa saw something heated in Ethan's green eyes that made her stomach flutter in a not unpleasant way. But true to his word, he stepped back slightly, giving her space. "We should probably get some sleep," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Tomorrow I will need to check my trap lines, and you will probably want to go through your father's belongings from the wagon. It will be a busy day." Teresa nodded, though she felt oddly disappointed that the night was ending so tamely. She changed behind the blanket again, this time into a proper nightdress that Martha had included in her packed belongings, and when she emerged, she found Ethan had already arranged his bedding on the floor by the fire again. "Ethan," she said softly, We are married now. You do not have to sleep on the floor." He looked at her, conflict clear in his expression. "Teresa, I promised I would not rush you." "You would not be rushing me," she replied, feeling brave despite her nervousness. "I am just saying that we could share the bed for sleeping. It is large enough, and it seems silly for you to be uncomfortable on the floor when you are my husband now." Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between desire and honor, but finally he nodded. "If you are sure, but I will stay on my side, I promise." They climbed into the bed from opposite sides, maintaining a careful distance between them, both lying stiffly on their backs and staring at the ceiling. The bed that had seemed so large when Teresa slept in it alone now felt much smaller, with Ethan's large frame taking up half of it, and she was intensely aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from his body. "Good night, Teresa," Ethan said softly into the darkness. "Good night, husband," Teresa replied, testing out the word and finding she liked the sound of it. She heard Ethan's breath catch slightly at the word, and then he rolled onto his side facing away from her. Teresa lay awake for a long time, listening to his breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep, thinking about the incredible turn her life had taken in just 2 days. She had gone from terrified and alone to married and safe, from having nothing to having a home and a partner. It seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale, and yet it was real. Eventually, she also rolled onto her side, and whether intentionally or unconsciously, she found herself shifting closer to Ethan's warmth, until her back was just barely touching his, until she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It felt good to have that contact, that connection, and she fell asleep with a small smile on her face. Teresa woke the next morning to find herself wrapped in Ethan's arms, her head pillowed on his chest, and one of his large hands resting protectively on her back. Sometime during the night, they had gravitated toward each other, seeking warmth and comfort in sleep. And now they were tangled together in a way that should have felt awkward, but somehow felt perfectly natural. She could hear Ethan's heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and strong, and she could feel the gentle movement of his breathing. She stayed very still, not wanting to wake him, wanting to preserve this peaceful moment a little longer. But then she felt Ethan's breathing pattern change, felt him wake up, and she tensed slightly, waiting to see how he would react to their closeness. Ethan's hand moved slowly on her back, a gentle caress, and she heard him sigh contentedly. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "I am sorry. I did not mean to crowd you." "You did not crowd me," Teresa said, lifting her head to look at him. His hair had come loose from its tie and spread across the pillow in dark waves, and with sleep still softening his features, he looked less intimidating, more approachable. "I think I probably moved closer to you first. Then we will share the blame," Ethan said with a small smile. He made no move to release her, and Teresa made no move to pull away, both of them content to stay in this gentle embrace a while longer. "What do you normally do at this time of morning?" Teresa asked. "Check my traps, tend the garden, chop wood, hunt if meat is getting low," Ethan listed. "The usual things needed to survive up here. It is a lot of work, I will not lie about that, but it is good work, honest work." "Can I help?" Teresa asked. "I do not know much about trapping or hunting, but I am strong and I learn quickly. I do not want to be useless." Ethan looked at her with surprise and approval. "You could never be useless. But yes, I would welcome your help. I can teach you what you need to know. It will be good to have a partner in the work." They finally, reluctantly, separated and got up to start the day. Teresa made breakfast while Ethan did the early morning chores, and she felt a deep satisfaction in these simple domestic tasks, in being useful and contributing. When Ethan came back inside, She had eggs and bacon ready, along with fresh coffee, and the look on his face made all her effort worthwhile. "I could get used to this," he said, sitting down at the table with obvious pleasure. "Coming into a hot breakfast and a beautiful wife. I keep thinking I will wake up and find I dreamed all of this." "If you are dreaming, then I am dreaming the same dream," Teresa replied, joining him at the table. "And I hope neither of us wakes up." After breakfast, Ethan took Teresa to check his trap lines, teaching her how to read signs of animal activity, how to set and reset traps humanely, how to move through the forest quietly and respectfully. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid for not knowing things, always encouraging her efforts. Teresa found she enjoyed learning these skills, enjoyed being out in the mountains with him, working together toward a common goal. They also spent time going through her father's belongings from the wagon, and Teresa felt tears prick her eyes as she handled things that had been his, that reminded her of better times when he was alive. Ethan gave her space to grieve, understanding that she needed this time to properly say goodbye, but he stayed close enough that she knew he was there if she needed support. "He would have liked you," Teresa said at one point, holding one of her father's favorite shirts. "He always said the measure of a man was in his actions, not his words. You have acted with nothing but honor since we met." "I wish I could have known him," Ethan replied sincerely. "Any man who raised a daughter like you must have been someone worth knowing." The days began to settle into a rhythm after that. Teresa learned more about mountain life, about the plants that could be eaten and those that could heal, about tracking animals and reading weather in the sky. Ethan taught her to shoot better, spending patient hours helping her improve her aim until she could hit a target reliably. In turn, Teresa brought organization to the cabin that it had lacked, cooking meals that were more varied than Ethan's simple fare, mending clothes and making curtains for the windows from cloth she found in her father's belongings. They talked for hours in the evenings, sitting by the fire, learning about each other's lives and dreams. Teresa told Ethan about growing up with her father, about her mother who she barely remembered but who her father had loved deeply. Ethan told her about his family in Ohio, about brothers killed in the war, about the things he had seen and done that still haunted him sometimes in nightmares. They shared their fears and hopes, their small joys and deep sorrows, building intimacy through words and understanding. Each night they shared the bed, and each morning they woke tangled together, and gradually the space between them grew smaller as they both acknowledged the attraction growing between them. Their kisses became longer and more frequent, their touches more lingering, but Ethan remained true to his word about not rushing her, always pulling back before things went too far. It was Teresa who finally decided she was ready for more, about 2 weeks after their marriage. They had been sitting by the fire after supper, and Ethan had been telling her a story about a bear he had once encountered, his face animated and his hands gesturing. And Teresa had suddenly been overwhelmed with affection for him, with desire for this good man who had become so important to her so quickly. She leaned over and kissed him in the middle of his sentence, cutting off his words with her lips, and Ethan responded immediately, pulling her closer with a small sound of surprise and pleasure. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate than any they had shared before, and Teresa felt heat building in her body, a wanting she had never experienced before. "Teresa," Ethan breathed against her lips, his hands shaking slightly where they held her waist. "We should stop." "I do not want to stop," Teresa said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Ethan, I am ready. I want to be your wife in every way." Ethan pulled back enough to look into her eyes, searching her face. "Are you certain? I will not be upset if you want to wait longer." "I am certain," Teresa said firmly. I love you, Ethan. I know it has only been 2 weeks, but I love you. You have shown me nothing but kindness and patience and care, and I want to show you how much that means to me. I want to be close to you in every way possible." The words seemed to break something in Ethan's control, and he kissed her again with renewed intensity, lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the bed. He was gentle with her, patient and careful, making sure she was comfortable and ready before proceeding. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces finally fitting into place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, both breathless and amazed, and Ethan held Teresa close as if she were something precious and fragile. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "I have loved you since that first moment, though I tried to tell myself it was too fast to be real. But it is real, isn't it? This connection between us." "It is real," Teresa confirmed, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I have never felt anything more real in my life." From that night forward, their marriage became complete in every sense. They grew even closer, learning each other's bodies as well as they had learned each other's minds and hearts, finding joy and pleasure in their physical connection. The cabin in the mountains became a true home, filled with love and laughter, a refuge from the world below. As autumn progressed toward winter, Teresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening as they sat by the fire, nervous about how he would react. But his whoop of joy and the way he lifted her off her feet in a careful hug told her everything she needed to know. He was delighted, already planning how he would build a cradle and add onto the cabin to make room for their growing family. The winter was long and sometimes harsh, but they weathered it together, staying close to the cabin when storms howled through the mountains, passing the time with conversation and lovemaking and planning for the future. Ethan proved to be as protective as Teresa had known he would be, constantly fussing over her health and safety, making sure she did not work too hard or take any risks that might endanger her or the baby. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted to reveal new growth, and the stream behind the cabin swelled with runoff, and Teresa felt her own body changing and growing along with the world around her. She had never been happier, had never felt more content with her life and her choices. One afternoon in early May, Sheriff Russell and Martha Wells made the trip up the mountain to visit, bringing news from town and supplies they thought the young couple might need. They were delighted to see how well Teresa and Ethan were doing, how obviously happy and in love they were. "Those 3 men who chased you have been caught and sent to prison," Sheriff Russell reported with satisfaction. "They will not be troubling anyone for a good long while. And the mining company has finally processed the paperwork for your father's share. There is $400 waiting for you in the bank whenever you want to come collect it." $400 was a small fortune, more money than Teresa had ever imagined having. She and Ethan discussed it that evening, and decided to use some of it to buy supplies and tools that would make their mountain life easier, and to save the rest for their children's future. They made a trip to town the following week, their first time back since the wedding, and Teresa was pleased to find that people treated her with respect, that her marriage to Ethan had given her a respectable position in the community. As summer arrived, Teresa grew large with the baby, and Ethan became even more protective, barely letting her do anything strenuous. Martha Wells came to stay with them as Teresa's due time approached, wanting to be there to help with the birth, and her presence was a comfort to both of them. The baby came on a hot July afternoon, and the birth was difficult but not dangerous. And when Martha finally placed the squalling infant in Teresa's arms, she felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it brought tears to her eyes. The baby was a boy, healthy and strong with a thick shock of dark hair like his father's. "A son," Ethan said, his voice choked with emotion as he looked down at his wife and child. "We have a son, Teresa." They named him Samuel, after Teresa's father, and Ethan proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband. He made the cradle he had promised, carved toys from wood, sang lullabies in a surprisingly pleasant voice when the baby fussed at night. Teresa watched him with their son and fell even more deeply in love, amazed by the gentleness this big, strong man showed to their tiny child. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple pleasures. They added onto the cabin as their family grew, welcoming a daughter named Emily 2 years after Samuel, and another son named Thomas 3 years after that. Each child was welcomed with joy, and their home rang with laughter and love. Ethan taught the children the ways of the mountains, passing on the skills he had taught Teresa, making sure they knew how to survive and thrive in the wilderness they called home. Teresa taught them to read and write, using books she ordered from Sacramento, determined that her children would have education even if they lived far from any school. They went to town several times a year, maintaining friendships there, selling furs and buying supplies, but they were always happy to return to their mountain home, to the peace and beauty of the life they had built together. The story of how they met, how Ethan had saved Teresa from a rattlesnake and then married her the same day, became something of a legend in Downeyville, a romantic tale that people loved to tell. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching their children play in the clearing. Samuel was 8 now, already showing signs of his father's size and strength. Emily was 6, wild and fearless, climbing trees and catching frogs with equal enthusiasm. Little Thomas was 3, toddling around and getting into everything with determined curiosity. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked, his arm around Teresa's waist as they surveyed their domain. "Marrying me so quickly, living up here away from everything." Teresa turned to look up at her husband, at the man who had saved her in every way possible, and smiled. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything, Ethan. A home, a family, love, safety. You gave me a life worth living." "You gave me the same," Ethan said, kissing her forehead gently. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You made me live again, made me want to build something beyond just survival. I would not change a single thing about our life together." They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built through love and hard work and unwavering commitment to each other. And Teresa thought back to that terrifying day when she had been running through these mountains, desperate and alone. And then that moment when Ethan appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice, moving the rattlesnake and clearing her path. He had cleared more than just her physical path that day. He had cleared the path to a future she never could have imagined, to happiness she never dared hope for. And she had spent every day since then grateful for the twist of fate that brought them together, for the courage they both showed in taking a chance on each other, for the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something strong and lasting. As darkness fell and they called their children inside for supper, Teresa sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever forces had guided Ethan to that mining shack at exactly the right moment, that had given her not just a rescuer but a partner, a lover, a friend, and the father of her children. She had been saved from that rattlesnake, yes, but more importantly, she had been saved from a life of fear and loneliness and struggle. And in saving her, Ethan had saved himself too, finding purpose and joy in their partnership that he never could have found alone. They had saved each other, really, in all the ways that mattered most. The years continued to pass in their mountain paradise, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. The children grew strong and capable under their parents' guidance, learning to love the wilderness as much as Ethan and Teresa did. Samuel became an excellent tracker and hunter. Emily showed a gift for healing and herb lore, and little Thomas developed an unexpected talent for carving intricate figures from wood. When Samuel turned 16, he began courting a girl from town, the daughter of the general store owner, and Teresa watched with mixed feelings as her eldest prepared to eventually leave and start his own life. But she understood that this was the natural way of things, that children grew up and moved on, carrying with them the lessons and love their parents had given them. Ethan, now in his 40s, had some gray threading through his dark hair, but he was still strong and vital, still the protective presence he had always been. Teresa, too, showed the marks of their years together in the lines around her eyes and the silver in her hair, but she had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did in Ethan's eyes. They became grandparents when Samuel married his sweetheart at 18 and welcomed a baby girl the following year. Emily eventually married a young doctor who had come to Downieville and was enchanted by her knowledge of mountain medicine. Thomas chose to stay on the mountain with his parents, building his own cabin nearby and making a living selling his carved figures to tourists who were beginning to visit California in greater numbers as the railroad expanded. Ethan and Teresa grew old together in the home they had built, surrounded by family and friends, respected members of their community despite their unconventional beginning. They never stopped being grateful for each other, never took for granted the love they shared, and they made sure to tell each other every day how much they meant to one another. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. Their children and grandchildren filled the expanded house and spilled out onto the porches, and there was food and laughter and music late into the night. Ethan stood to make a toast, his arm around Teresa, and looked out at all the faces surrounding them, all the lives that had come into being because of their union. 25 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his years. I was walking through these mountains alone as I had been for a long time, and I heard a rattlesnake's warning. When I came upon the scene, I found the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, trapped between that snake and safety. I moved the snake, cleared her path, and thought that would be the end of it, but fate had other plans. He looked down at Teresa with such love that she felt her throat tighten with emotion. I married this woman the same day I met her, the craziest and best decision I ever made. She has been my partner, my love, my reason for everything good in my life since that day. Together we built this home, this family, this life that I treasure more than I can ever express. Ethan raised his glass. To Teresa, my wife, my heart, thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man. Thank you for giving me everything. To Teresa and Ethan. Everyone chorused, raising their own glasses, and Teresa wiped away happy tears as she was surrounded by the family and love she had helped create. Later, when the celebration had wound down and it was just the two of them again in their quiet cabin, Ethan pulled Teresa close on the porch, and they watched the stars emerge over the mountain peaks like they had done thousands of times before. Any regrets yet? Ethan asked, repeating the question he had asked on their 10th anniversary. Not a single one, Teresa replied, giving the same answer she always did because it was always true. You. Only that I did not meet you sooner, Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. But I will take the years we have had and be grateful for everyone. They stood together in the mountain silence, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from the most unlikely of beginnings. And Teresa thought once more about that rattlesnake that had coiled between her and the door she needed. At the time, it had seemed like just another danger, another obstacle in a life full of them. But now she saw it for what it truly was, the catalyst that had brought her to Ethan, the final barrier between her old life and her new one. Ethan had moved that snake and cleared her path, yes, but what he had really done was clear the path to her future, to a life filled with more love and happiness than she ever dreamed possible. And she had cleared his path too, bringing light and purpose back to a man who had been lost in his own way, wandering alone in the wilderness. They had saved each other, and in doing so, had created something that would last far beyond their own lives, a legacy of love and family that would continue through their children and their children's children, rippling out into the world in ways they could never fully know. As they went inside to sleep in the bed they had shared for 25 years, Teresa sent up one final prayer of gratitude for the rattlesnake, for the mountain man, for the courage they both found to take a leap of faith together. It had been the best decision of her life, and she would make it again without hesitation, would always choose this man, this life, this love. Ethan and Teresa lived many more years in their mountain home, growing older together with grace and continued devotion. They watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own, creating a sprawling family tree that all traced back to that one fateful day in 1873, when a mountain man moved a rattlesnake and found his future wife. When Ethan finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, Teresa grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing she had given him the best years possible, that he had died happy and fulfilled, surrounded by the evidence of the wonderful life they had built together. She lived another 5 years after him, spending her final days telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the brave, strong man who had saved her life, and then spent the rest of his own making sure she knew she was loved. The cabin in the mountains remained in the family, passed down through generations, always remembered as the place where a great love story began. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, people swore they could see two figures standing on the porch, arms around each other, looking out over the mountains they had loved so well. The legend of how Ethan and Teresa met never faded from Downieville's collective memory. It was told and retold, embellished and romanticized, but always the core truth remained, that a woman in desperate need had been saved by a good man, and they had both been brave enough to choose love even when it seemed crazy, even when it happened too fast to make sense. Their story became an inspiration to others who found themselves in difficult circumstances, a reminder that sometimes rescue comes from unexpected places, that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil, and that the best decisions are often the ones that seem the most impulsive at the time. And somewhere in those California mountains, the descendants of that original rattlesnake still coiled in the sun, never knowing that one of their ancestors had played such a crucial role in bringing two souls together, in creating a love story that would be remembered for generations, in clearing a path that led not just to safety, but to everything that makes life worth living.